Hey, please welcome to the show, Jack Hues. Hey, Jack.
Hi, how you doing, Will?
I'm doing well. I've got to say, it's not going to be odd for you. It's only odd for me to have followed your career for as long as I have, and now be able to finally speak with you. I feel as if I
Mm,
know you through your prior interviews, your performances, your music. But so I have to temper myself how I approach, this conversation, I suppose, because I have.
okay.
It's got to be strange for you though, as an artist, to meet folks who feel like they know you in a way that they couldn't possibly know you,
Yeah,
but for your work.
yeah. I think that sort of goes with the territory. That's always been the case, and I guess everybody sort of experiences that a bit with like Facebook. You have friends and stuff who you probably don't know at all,
Right.
actually, but who follow you or whatever. So
Yes.
yeah, but yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Oh, good. Hey, I want to sort of go through a little bit of a chronology of your work as part of Wang Chung,
Yeah.
going back to the 1980s. But I know you're touring right now as part of the Abducted by the
Mhm.
80s tour. And we're catching you sort of mid dates here, and folks can go to abductedbythe80s.com to find out where they can see you and some of the other greats from the 1980s performing alongside you as well.
Yeah.
How has touring changed? Do you feel, is it different for you to experience it now at this point in your life versus back in the 1980s?
It's a different scale for sure. Yeah, back in the 1980s, I mean, we didn't do a lot of touring actually as a headlining act, but we did do these big tours with the Cars in 1984 and with Tina Turner in 1987, and they were playing massive stadium kind of things. And exciting though that was, it was a sort of quite a strange experience, I suppose, in terms of how you orientate yourself to the audience. But I think since we've begun touring again around about 2008-9, where Nick and I got back together and decided to do some more stuff. There's less pressure. It's possibly more work in the sense of the traveling is a little more onerous than it used to
Mm,
be. But then, having said that, I think those tours were kind of pretty much back-to-back gigs, and so you'd be flying early mornings to get to wherever you had to go. So yeah, I think the touring is more comfortable now, and certainly we don't feel the pressure in the way that we used to because the audience have already uh, signed up to Wang Chung, if you know what I mean. Whereas
right.
back in the day they were kind of like checking us out a bit more. So
Yeah. It does seem, and look, I want to talk about this a little bit later on, but look, the premise of our show is that, the 1980s culture, probably unlike other decades before, has some sort of staying power. And I'm not quite
mm,
sure what it is, except I do think there was some sort of alchemy going on during that decade as far as, and almost like the Renaissance of hundreds of years earlier, where there was this,
mm,
all these things coming together, globalization, technology, in a
mm.
way that, births great music. Are the audiences, do you see a mix of ages now, age groups in the
Yeah.
audiences?
Yeah, we did a show. God, you lose track of time, but it was probably a couple of
Sure.
days ago. And there were these two sort of early 20s guys who came up to us, with their sort of thrift shop version of the Wang Chung album, and just really thrilled to meet us and huge fans. So yeah, there's a whole range of age groups now, and that's the real upside of the streaming uh, model for music, which is I think tough on a lot of acts, especially younger bands, to make that work financially. But for us, it's part of other revenue streams, and certainly the access to Wang Chung now is, and I guess it goes alongside of the fact that our music gets used in a lot of movies and
Right.
TV shows, particularly right now. And so, you could just click Wang Chung and then you've got the whole discography and away you go.
Right. And since you mentioned it, right, of course, we just saw this article just a few days ago where you had just learned that To Live and Die in LA is being used as the theme, or was, for John Mulaney's live show on Netflix, but you had no idea. I talked about this a little bit on our show recently, and folks said, well, how could Jack not know? How could Nick not know? Can you explain
Yeah.
how licensing or that would work?
I guess because the business end of things that are dealt with by like our publishing company or Universal, in terms of the recordings, so
Right.
they do all that stuff. Occasionally, they'll let us know if it's something. It's usually if it's like some sort of special deal that's got to be done, But most times, they do the deals, and we just find out about it. And
Right.
I was talking to a guy yesterday actually who sort of said, um, like with orchestography. Do you mean, so you sort of sat down and thought we want to do an orchestral record and planned it all out? The planning doesn't come from us at all. These things come to us.
Mm.
Then we kind of field it and deal with it as best we can. And obviously this John Mulaney thing has been fab because they're not only using the music, but they're using the whole graphic style of the movie to contextualize his show. So it really works fantastic.
Yeah, in watching the beginning of that, that intro that you're referring to on this current Netflix show, yeah, I was reminded how, I guess, it's almost inseparable for me, that song in particular from the film, that I wasn't sure if it was me bringing the movie to the John Mulaney show or they had just did such an homage to the film that the connection sort of, worked again. But yeah.
That's how it looked to me, a real homage, with even the graininess of the film, the way they've textured it, and certainly the colours and everything, and the graphic style, the fonts they use and stuff. It's totally homage to Billy Friedkin, basically, who created the movie, But I think, we've talked about it quite a lot, the symbiotic relationship between the music and that movie, and the fact that Billy cut the film to the music in quite a lot of instances, And I think I never understand why people don't do that more, and let the music kind of run the show for a little bit. I must say, I struggle with most modern movies in the way the soundtrack is forced to kind of reflect what's going on in front of you. It's like a sort of musical analog to what's going on in front of you, and I feel that's such a waste of music. It's the music should be a character of its own in the movie, and I think that's what you have with To Live and Die in LA.
Yeah, and I thought, we could take a step back in a moment, I suppose, and learn how you got to that in the first place. But the way, and I will say William Friedkin, because certainly didn't have that familiarity that you do. But Mr. Friedkin, the way he cut it, I thought how he used your music was so interesting because there's these moments where it just ends. It creates a mood that you get caught up in, and then it ends. It almost. And it's almost a spoiler almost for the ending of the movie, which I won't ruin for anybody. They should just check out the movie. It's a great film, but that don't get too used to anything.
Yeah.
Things could just change.
Well, when we first had the conversations about the music, he said, I want to juxtapose the music into the film. I remember him using that word. So it was kind of like a situation where it's the exact opposite of the way most movies are scored, which is where the score has to reflect the emotional temperature of the scene. He was kind of like, I'm not interested in that. I want to have essentially what have quite tense scenes with no music sort of thing. And then at the point where you would normally relax, as it were, and the dialogue takes a break and stuff, that's where the music comes in and it's really hard hitting. So the movie has this constant sense of tension about it, And I think that, especially these days, at the time it was groundbreaking, because the people weren't doing that stuff. These days it's a lot of action movies do that, But it's very clever the way he did it all.
So how he pitched it to you, and I know you at university you did study. My understanding, you did study music composition and using electronic instruments. Even had he pitched it to you, scoring it in a more traditional way, would it have been a thing that you would not have been interested in?
No, I'd be certainly doing a movie soundtrack was something I always wanted to do. I think I did do a more conventional score for him for a movie called The Guardian, which. It's a very strange film, but I did that after Wang Chung split, really. And for me, it was great because it was like I just threw the kitchen sink at this thing, had he asked us to do a more conventional score, we would have still been sort of jumped at it. But I think what was good about, I think with a lot of artistic projects, those first decisions you make about who you're going to work with, whether it's the musicians you choose for your band or the studio you choose to work in or whatever, those things are very fundamental to the way things go. If you get those things right, then a lot of it is just like letting it all happen, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And I think that's what happened with To Live and Die,
Right. And so taking a step back for folks who don't know, what we're talking about is, you were approached by William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist, French Connection, one of my favorite films, right before or when Mr. Friedkin approaches you. This is right after the success of Points on a Curve, led by Dance Hall Days. Your first album out with Geffen. I imagine there's pressure to create another hit song right after that, or another hit album. And instead you do the film. Is that in part because I imagine it's super hard to come up with hit songs? Let's try something different, or less pressure maybe, or?
That's exactly how it worked. I mean, once again, it wasn't like we thought, so, you have a hit like Dance All Days, and the record label, understandably, are sort of like, okay, so write another one of those. But as an artist, you can't do that. I have no idea how I wrote Dance All Days, and not that I haven't tried to sort of, do that again, but you simply can't, because the music's coming from who knows where it's coming from, and so we were in the studio trying to make this second album and recording these songs, which hopefully will see the light of day in the anthology type things that we're going to be doing in the very near future. But this wasn't working really. And then out of the blue came this phone call from William Friedkin asking us, if we'd be interested in scoring this movie, So, and it really did at the time feel like, yes, this is exactly what we should be doing. The record label Geffen were not into us doing it at the time because they were so focused on, you don't do movie scores, you make hit records, and that's the game you're in, But we persuaded them, or our manager persuaded them to give us a week in the studio to work on this project, which we did. And, and again, I think the fact that we produced it ourselves and that it was all done pretty much very spontaneously, that still comes across in the record, in the album. So, yeah, it was great timing. But again, it was the gods who were timing it, not us.
Right. Are you aware of the fact that I see this pop up every now and then? When looking for content for my show, that Dance Hall Days occasionally pops up on these controversial lyrics lists.
Yeah.
You've seen this? Some of the folks. Take your baby by the ears. Okay, what are we talking about here? Play upon her darkest fears. Again, you're talking about divine inspiration, so I don't know necessarily the origin of these lyrics, but I guess what are your thoughts about folks thinking that these are controversial?
Well, I kind of like that they think it's controversial. It sort of is, I mean, when I wrote it, you're sort of thinking more about rhymes and the rhythm of the words in a sense more than precise meanings, and certainly it's not like there's a hidden meaning that I'm trying to get across, But I do remember that with Dance All Days we got a phone call from Quincy Jones, I think before we recorded the Geffen version of it, and he said he was at that time working on Thriller for Michael Jackson, and he was saying Michael loves Dance All Days, he's interested in recording, and we had a meeting with Quincy about it, and he said the problem is the lyrics, they're kind of weird. We need to change them, and in my naivety I just thought, well, I don't really want to change the lyrics, So that opportunity drifted by, and who knows, sliding doors and all that stuff. But I get that, that even at that time with Dance All Days there's this strange mixture of it evokes a sense of nostalgia, because that's kind of what it's like about Dance All Days, and the saxophone parts and especially the videos really played up to that, but there is also this sense of kind of surreal quality to the lyrics, moving from Take Your Baby by the Hand, which was very much inspired by the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand, but of course with the Beatles we knew they didn't just want to hold your hand, and they wanted to do all sorts of other things,
Sure.
And in a sense Dance All Days charts that kind of that thing, but in a surreal kind of way, and I think all of my lyrics are probably more impressionistic rather than giving you a narrative, if you know what I mean. So I like the fact that people want to interpret and they want to put their mark on it, but there's hopefully there's quite a lot of scope for interpretation.
Yeah, and I guess staying on the topic of lyrics for a moment here. Of course, your next big hit is Everybody Have Fun in 1986, your album after the soundtrack for To Live and Die in L.A.
Yeah.
Do words make our reality, Jack?
Yeah, I think they do.
Yeah.
In the beginning was the word, and I don't say that as a religious person, but I think consciousness, I think reality is a product of consciousness rather than the other way around, and in that sense, I think the language, certainly the language you use in the world, creates your reality for other people, but I think it creates it for yourself as well, and then it's pretty basic psychology, isn't it? If you're saying negative things to yourself all the time, life becomes pretty negative, and so no, I really believe, language creates reality. Yeah.
I find myself quoting your song to my children as they're growing up. You know,
Mm.
they don't necessarily know the origin until the song is on, and then I see mystical in a sense that I've
Yeah.
been quoting this spiritualist from this pop song
Yeah.
for all these years. But yeah, we're definitely our family subscribes to that mentality as well.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's a big subject. It's something I'm very interested in, actually.
Yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Me too. I've
Yeah.
read a lot of books on that area of
Yeah. 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 No, I have a friend who's a neuroscientist, and
okay.
he's into that whole, everything that happens just is happening in your brain, and it's just like this kind of computer with some weirdness about it, and I think that
Yeah.
not that it's you're kind of plugged into a consciousness net,
Mm-hmm.
and I think when you say, dance all days, write another one sort of thing. It's like, and I say I can't do that. That just seems like willfully difficult. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like, well, you've done it once, do it again. But that's the doing of songwriting is not like the doing of the washing up or something. It's
Right.
so it's definitely coming in from somewhere, I think. And I do have that sense of. I'm not saying the songs are channeled and it's all mystical, but
Right.
there's some sort of interaction with that consciousness that's out there.
It is. It is strange, right? Music
Yeah.
does seem to. I've said this before. I've studied music somewhat. Certainly, I'm not a Jack Hughes, and I did do some scoring for theater for New York theater
Oh,
years
cool.
ago. Is what I did.
Yeah.
But there is that. You talked about almost like divine inspiration. Music is this weird thing, right? Like you said, you don't know where it necessarily comes from. You sit at a piano or hold a guitar, and
Yeah. And also that it produces an emotional reaction in people.
yeah,
It's very curious. There's because it's a language of emotions in a sense, but it seems almost impossible to interpret it in a kind of like, okay, well, that chord means this and that chord
yeah,
means that. Some people try and do that, but it falls down because
yeah.
sometimes a major C major chord can sound infinitely sad. So
It's always bizarre to me that it could be that sort of ethereal sort of thing, but
yeah,
also have math behind it in a sense.
yeah,
Where
yeah,
a certain chord is going to follow another chord
yeah.
in a certain key. It's crazy how it has both of those elements
Yeah,
to it.
yeah. No, I mean, I think when people talk about that consciousness and stuff, this neuroscientist friend and I have long conversations about music, because he would spout his stuff, and I say that sounds like I'm putting him down because he's fascinating and doing proper research, with things in people's brains and stuff, but when we start talking about music, it's kind of like, yeah, that's hard to account for, And I know it's Steven Pinker who said, music is like oral cheesecake, it's just a sort of added extra that we've got. And I kind of think, I think music comes first, actually, music before language. I'm sure the earliest human beings were, making music with each other before they were trying to talk about how to do the washing up.
Yeah. This is going to make me sound maybe even, I'm going even further in the deep end here, so to speak.
Great.
But I've had experiences where, and not, more than a handful, certainly more of a handful, where someone is singing a song that I was thinking, or vice
Mm-hmm.
versa, where it seems to again exist in a. And now this sounds even, I don't know, further out there, but that I'm not sure what's happening there. And then we have that conversation. Were you singing that aloud and therefore inspired me? No, I was quietly
Yeah.
thinking this, and you sang it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
very interesting.
yeah. So you talk about music as a method of communication. We talk about you've scored some films, of course. Have you ever considered writing a musical? I'm struck by how narrative so many of your songs are. And then when I heard some of the arrangements on orchestrology for some of the songs, it's like I think about the world in which we live specifically. I'm like, okay, if this isn't the opening song for a Broadway show, I don't know what is. Have you ever considered musicals?
No, I never have. I don't get on with musicals.
Yeah. Okay.
I love opera. I'm really into opera, and one of my favourite things is going to opera houses in Europe. Just like choosing a weekend and thinking, okay, this is some Mozart operas on or something. But musicals, yeah, I've always struggled with the kind of like sort of jazz hands aspect of musicals, and I think it's the era that I grew up in. Musicals were the kind of opposite end of the kind of alternative. It wasn't called that then, but bands like even the Beatles, really, because they were generating their own music, and it was the aesthetic of it was the complete opposite of the musical. Do you know what I mean? So everything much more. The way they stated emotion was more understated, if that's a bit convoluted way of saying it. But yeah, there's nothing in the Beatles output that I think sounds like a song from a musical, you know. And,
Yes.
you know, and then
Yeah.
when you get into bands like, you know, Hendrix or Led Zepp or whatever, then it's even less kind of. You're in a completely different musical sphere. You know, I guess it's a sphere that's more in the realm of sort of jazz and improvised music and stuff like that. You know, and again, there's something about the theatre-ness of musicals that leaves me a little cold. You know, even the ones like West Side Story is kind of like, surely you like West Side Story, but even that I find a tough listen. You know?
Yeah. Well, I could see that being consistent with your comment about not scoring at the same level of emotion already being, you know,
Yeah,
performed. It's like,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if a Wang Chung the musical ever came out, I'd applaud. I'm sure, you know, but I'm not sure that I'd be the best person to work on it.
you know, it is curious though that you like opera because that almost seems antithetical to what you're saying because that's
Yeah,
so over the top as far as.
it is, but it's a different aesthetic somehow because
Hmm,
again, I think musicals are driven by the narrative, the story, you know,
I
whereas opera
see.
is driven by the music, you know. And although a lot of people would argue with that and say no, 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 it's the, you know, the big emotion is articulated in the narrative sort of thing. That's slightly true, but I think, you know, like I've taken various friends to the opera, you know, and they're kind of like, so what am I supposed to listen to? And I just say, just shut your eyes and listen to the music, you know,
Hmm.
because it's really that's where it's all at. If you know what I mean, the
Right.
music tells you that you need to know. You know,
Right. Yeah. Obviously, that's confirmed by the fact sometimes you don't need to speak the language that they're actually singing on stage, and you can
exactly right,
get a lot of
exactly
it.
right.
Yeah. So you mentioned
Yeah,
the Beatles a few times. I know you're a fan.
yeah.
What was music like in your home growing up?
Well, my dad was a saxophone player, so a jazz musician. Although he was more
Mm,
into sort of bands, and I guess his favourite sax players were Stan Getz, Paul Desmond. So these
mm,
kind of quite gentle players, you know. And I think growing up with the Beatles, that's, I've said this many times, you know, when I heard Please Please Me on the radio, it immediately was like, so this is my music.
mm,
And my dad, that music, I like this music, you know. And, but I was very lucky to have a sympathetic dad who bought me a guitar when I wanted one. And, you know, so there was music around, but, and I guess growing up in the UK as well, at that time, you know, pop music wasn't really available. You know,
mm.
you really had to search it out. You know, and I remember having a little transistor radio with an earpiece thing,
Right.
and you
Hmm.
know, I sort of lay in bed at night, sort of just trying to get Radio Luxembourg and stuff. You know, and these places where you could hear pop music. So there was music, but it was. Yeah, like my dad's stuff, which was more big band oriented. And then my grandparents, my grandfather was an orchestral conductor, an amateur one, but he was into classical stuff, you know. And that, in a sense, made more sense to me than the jazz did at the time. And
Right.
again, the Beatles were an amazing band to grow up with because they started to bring in those textures, you know, like in Yesterday, the kind of string quartet texture. Um, but again, it was a very pared down version of strings. You know, it wasn't gushing Mantovani strings. You
Right.
know, like in a musical. It was this more kitchen sink drama strings. You know, and so yeah, it was a. I think, you know, growing up that sort of 62 to 1970 period, the evolution of music through that time, and me learning guitar through that time. And, you know, very young. I was like sort of 7 years old when I started playing guitar, and but it was an incredible time to be this music kind of impacting you,
Right.
and like the Beatles again, you know, each new album that they made was like a different planet from the one that you'd listened to before. You know, it was like the quantum leaps from Rubber Soul to Revolver to Sergeant
Right.
Pepper to the White Album. You know, were like, it was, you know, you couldn't have a better learning thing going on. You know.
And did you remain a fan as they evolved?
Yeah, it did. It's been interesting, you know, because Let It Be has just come out, hasn't it? The remastered version of the
Hmm.
original Let It Be,
Right.
and I sort of get with that they had sort of lost the plot a bit, you know,
Mm,
and for the first time, and that continued with Abbey Road. I know a lot of people love Abbey Road, but I always feel it's an album where they're following the pack rather than leading it, you know,
mm,
and that to me is the least successful Beatles record. You know, when they're setting the pace and their influences are kind of like, well, it's really difficult to figure out, you know, what the influence for Sergeant Pepper was because they were really
right.
creating a whole new world with that album. You know, so with Abbey Road, I felt they were more imitating a lot of stuff that was coming up, and of course, Abbey Road came out in the context of Hendrix and the Cream and
Yeah.
the beginnings of progressive rock and stuff. So the times they were changing, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think weren't they split up or splitting up during the Abbey Road as well? So they weren't.
They were, yeah, yeah. And again, I think Peter Jackson's version of that, Get Back, as it's called, the 8 hour
Right.
thing, is a fascinating insight into what was going on. Because it's like, that whole creative process with a group of people and how it falls apart, and inevitably falls apart, because as an artist, you can't stay in the one place doing the same thing all the time. You've got to move on. So, for example, John meeting Yoko and her retuning him back into like being an art student again, in a sense,
Right.
and thinking of art as a kind of it's a deeply serious thing, I suppose, as opposed to the entertainment qualities of being the Beatles. I can totally see why he wanted to leave that behind and move into that new territory.
Right. And I suppose thinking of that in the context of Wang Chung, obviously you and Nick, there was periods of time where you were together and then you were apart,
Yeah.
and you did solo work, and you continue to do solo work even though you've reunited.
Yeah.
What is it? How is it different creating Wang Chung or writing music with Nick versus working alone?
Mm. Well, I guess Nick and I did tend to work alone, as even within Wang Chung.
Okay.
We'd sort of write songs. Usually they'd be slightly half finished, if you know what I mean. And then we'd have these afternoons where we just sit together and he played me a whole load of his ideas and I play him mine. And then we sort of select, so Everybody Had Fun Tonight came out of that. It was at the end of a quite long afternoon of ideas. He played me this Everybody Have Fun Tonight thing, and I just said, oh, that's really good. He goes, God, I thought you'd hate that. I was like, no, it's something about that, and I sort of took it away and wrote the sort of ballad version of it, which has been out there for some time on one of our greatest hits albums. But then when we worked with Peter Wolf, he was kind of like, oh, guys, come on, this is a party record, and so we sort of rejigged it a lot in the studio, But so working with Nick was, we tended to work to a certain extent in isolation anyway, and then doing my own stuff. I think, the last 10 years for me has been a pretty intense sort of emotional time, in a sense. My wife passed away exactly 10 years ago.
Sorry about that.
And it's, I think that sort of journey, as it were, at this point in my life, I've got kids, 3 beautiful, well, they're not kids anymore, they're grown-ups, and the way those relationships have developed, and the relationships that have come to me sort of since that time, I guess I've generated a lot of emotional stuff, and my solo albums, in a sense, come out of that experience, and then I think the impetus that's then given me to be creative, and also living in a house where I got my studio, and most of the time I'm on my own, so it's like, so what shall I do? I'll just switch everything on and kind of do stuff,
Right.
And whereas in the 80s, I had 3 young children and a full-on life, so time for writing, in a sense, I had to be more focused, So I find now I can sort of sprawl around, and also, I'm in a very fortunate position of get a load of ideas and then just, work with some friends and get it into a sort of album structure and put it out there, and it's like, so it's that would be impossible back in the 80s.
Do you find it harder to be less productive almost because you have the freedom that you do now?
Yeah, it's a very productive time,
Okay,
and
very
between
good.
the solo albums and my jazz stuff, I mean, I'm not a jazz player, but I work with jazz musicians, and the sort of freedom that gives me, to think about, just jamming, basically,
Yeah.
So I released an album called Epigonal Quark a couple of years ago, so it's a double vinyl album of, these sort of extended jams on actually a Radiohead song, and a song by Robert Wyatt, as well as some sort of self-penned stuff as well, So, but yeah, it's great to work with musicians who just, when you do a Wang Chung gig, it's quite structured, really. Songs are a certain way. You can mess it up by forgetting bits and stuff. With the jazz thing, the music might be just like on the back of an envelope, really. Do you know what I mean? And you just start playing, and it goes where it goes, and which I find really exciting.
Right. Hearing about all, and we'll start to wrap up here. I know it's been almost 30. It's been about 30 minutes so far.
Sure.
hearing about all your background and your influences, etc., I think you can hear that. Certainly, this not. I'm saying something completely obvious. It comes out in the your Wang Chung music. Certainly,
Mhm.
I could now understand why some of the decisions you make musically are not straightforward. Pop. Uh, and so it's not a surprise to me. In fact, this may sound strange to you, but I think "Abducted by the '80s," which is a more recent song,
Mhm.
there's something Beatles-esque about that to me. Hearing that.
I can totally hear that. Yeah, because their influence is there in the background all the time, and so it would definitely come through. I think,
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's a very cool song. I think "Abducted by the '80s." Rob G, wasn't it? He was a comedian. He still is a comedian, who my daughter saw when she was at university, and she said, "Oh, Rob G, he's so great, Dad. You got to check him out." Do you know what I mean? And I think she sent me this recording of him doing, which is what we used in the song, And I
Right.
mean, all of the references are very kind of like '80s English, So I'm not sure they
Yeah.
totally translate into the States. But I really liked how that spoken word thing interacted with the music, and I guess the music is quite influenced by like Philip Glass and those sorts of composers. It's kind of like little repeating patterns that keep
Right.
shifting slightly.
Yeah. And I think maybe and I think most of the references translate. Uh,
Okay, good.
but maybe the chorus is wrong now. Maybe you want to revise this idea that everyone's moved on, because here we are chatting
Yeah,
so many years later.
absolutely. It is slightly melancholy, the notion that we've all got washed up in the '80s. But no, it's it's more dynamic than ever, and I think particularly this John Mulaney show, the Everybody's in LA, and also Dancehall Day is being used in this Netflix
Right.
movie called The Idea of You. Suddenly, Wang Chung feels like it's quite contemporary, actually. So
Yeah. Hey, we agree. Uh, Jack, with that, I will let you go. I want to remind folks that you are on tour right now. You can go to abductedbythe80s.com to find out where. And very soon, August Records is going to be releasing a compilation, it seems, of all these now orchestrated or orchestral versions of 80 songs, including some of the songs that I think they're probably the ones they did for Orchesology, right? The
that's
same.
right. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Which
No,
are
we're very happy about
fantastic.
that. Yeah, yeah. That's again, getting your music heard in all of the noise of the contemporary music scene.
Yeah.
But I'm glad August Day are putting out this compilation. It'll allow people to sample some of the hits and hopefully get into that particular album, where we did explore some more off the beaten track Wang Chung stuff, So
Yeah. And what's amazing to me is how well the music lends itself to these orchestrations. And
people
that,
love it, yeah, and I'm very pleased about that. I think we did try. Sometimes I think, you put synths, drums, guitars on a track, and then you add the orchestra. There's not much room for the orchestra, so we try to sort of like take out as much as we possibly could to allow the orchestra to speak in the textures, and in certain songs, I think like Space Junk in particular, and there's a song called Overwhelming Feeling, which is really just purely orchestral,
yeah.
and I think those songs in particular work really well orchestrated. But people love Dancehall Days, and everybody had fun tonight in the orchestral versions as well. And yeah, I was very, very happy with the outcome of that album.
Yeah, they gave me goosebumps, quite honestly.
That's
When you
great.
hit the chorus on, Dance Hall Days, for example.
Yeah,
But yeah, and I love it. You could tell there was some very, smart thinking behind the arrangements, because, like, Space Junk is a good example, because it was like, all right, with the orchestra, maybe we can't replicate this percussion sound that's so unique. We'll use that. But
yeah,
everything else, that was fantastic. I think it's fantastic. So
yeah.
smart.
Yeah, and there's stuff like using the bass clarinet to try and play the riff,
Right.
and that sort of yeah, I kind of like that. I really like that.
Yeah. All right. Hey, folks, you got plenty of opportunities to check out Jack and Nick as they tour, and certainly on the forthcoming album. Thank you so much for your time today, Jack.
It's been a pleasure, Will. I really appreciate you going a bit deeper than usual on this stuff. So great, thank you.